This year, the federal government's interest charges will be about $50 billion.
Oh,
that's about the same amount of money that the federal government sends to the provinces in health transfers. Interest charges, health transfers.
This is the Canadian Taxpayers Federation podcast, where we are fighting for lower taxes, less waste, and more accountable government. I'm Chris Sims. I'm the Alberta Director for the CTF here in Lethbridge, Alberta. And my good friend Franco Terrazzano, he's at our embassy there in Ottawa. He's the Federal Director. Franco, there's been a bit of a protest going on recently about one of our favorite subjects, the carbon tax. And we put out some data that got a lot of attention, and that is the fact that the folks in Quebec aren't paying the same amount of carbon tax that the rest of Canada is. So we got a lot of interest in this little tidbit of information. Can you explain how is it that Quebec is getting a special deal?
Well, all provinces are equal, but one province is just a little bit more equal in the eyes of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And Trudeau is giving Quebec a special deal on the carbon tax. Okay, so here's how Trudeau's mandatory minimum carbon tax it works, or at least according to him. He says that all provinces must pay a similar carbon tax, right? Either you pay the federal one or you have to have a provincial carbon tax that is about the same as the federal carbon tax. Well, that's not exactly how it's working out, okay? So if you live outside of Quebec, every other Canadian, like you and my mom in Lethbridge, well, you're paying a carbon tax that is $80 per ton. Every other Canadian. In Quebec, it's $57 a ton. $80 a ton in the rest of Canada, $57 a ton in Quebec. Those numbers aren't exactly the same. Now, here's what it means for you in your day-to-day life, okay? So if you're outside of Quebec, if you're in Alberta, you're paying about 4 cents per liter more at the pumps in carbon taxes than in Quebec. On natural gas, you're paying about 5 cents per cubic meter more in carbon tax alone than in Quebec. But that carbon tax gap is only going up, okay? So in 2030, the federal carbon tax applied in every other province and territory will be $170 a ton. In Quebec, $97 a ton.
Okay.
So that means, Chris, okay, for you, for my mom out there, every time you go to fuel up the minivan, you're paying about 14 cents a liter of gas more in carbon tax than the same family in Trudeau's riding in Montreal. Now, let's say in 2030, you're filling up a minivan once a week. Well, you're going to be paying about $500 more in carbon tax on the gasoline over the course of the year than that same family in Quebec.
Wow. Okay. So that is a huge difference in cost. Now, you and I you put out a lot of information on this. You put out a great video on this. Folks, if you haven't seen it yet, like Franco's got his glasses on and he's got cue cards going and he's showing the actual price difference. And that actually really matters because then the number kind of sticks in your head and you remember, okay, that is a bigger number that we're paying in the rest of Canada. And why though? Like, what is the difference? So I'm hearing some chirping going, okay, so I'm from British Columbia. All right. Now, British Columbia has their own provincial carbon tax, but the catch there is that number one, for a long time, it was higher than the federal carbon tax. And now it's just locked into what they call the federal backstop. In normal people talk, that's a mandatory minimum carbon tax that Trudeau is forcing upon almost every region of Canada. So BC is different because they pay about the same amount. And in fact, their rebates are less. What's the deal with Quebec, though? Can you describe that for us?
Okay, so Quebec has a bit of a different system, but at the end of the day, it's still a carbon tax. A tax is a tax is a tax. And those costs flow down to the consumers at the pumps or on your heating bill. So what Quebec has is called a cap and trade carbon tax. Okay. But here's the thing, right? It works out in the same way, or it's supposed to work out in the same way. And I've heard a lot of people say, well, the reason that Quebec has this so-called special deal is because it has cap and trade. But that doesn't really add up, okay? Because in Nova Scotia, before last year, Nova Scotia also had a cap and trade provincial carbon tax. But Trudeau didn't let Nova Scotia keep its cap and trade carbon tax. Trudeau came in last July and hammered Nova Scotians with the single largest carbon tax hike in Canadian history. Okay. And if you look at the emissions, well, the federal government publishes this emissions data. And Nova Scotia reduced its emissions by 36% since 2005. Quebec reduced its emissions by 12% since 2005. Okay, so maybe Trudeau should be picking up the call, phoning Nova Scotia and asking for advice rather than hammering Nova Scotians and really all Canadians with higher carbon taxes. So that whole cap and trade narrative just doesn't add up. And it's not just the Canadian Taxpayers Federation that has been pointing this out. There's been an editorial in the Globe and Mail. There's been another opinion piece in the Globe and Mail, essentially pointing out the fact that Quebec is getting special treatment on the carbon tax. Even La Presse, a French outlet, has made this point that the carbon tax in Quebec is lower than in every other province and territory. Now, here's the thing, right? Let me put 2 points forward. Number one, this is just more proof that the carbon tax is about the political science, not the environmental science. Okay. But point number two is, like, we want to scrap the carbon tax all over Canada. Yeah. All across Canada. We don't want any Canadian to pay the carbon tax because it makes the necessities of life more expensive and it's not going to solve a global issue. Okay. So we think the fair solution is just scrap the carbon tax altogether. Everyone pays the same, zero. No carbon tax in Canada. That's our solution.
Yeah, that's definitely the best solution for this entire mess. Now, to your point on Nova Scotia, I really need to stress this because some of the fancy people in the Quebec-Windsor corridor are now trying to say, oh, well, if you'd just been a little bit better of a province, if you'd tried a little bit harder, then Prime Minister Trudeau would have gifted you with your own version of the carbon tax and you wouldn't be in this mess. That is just nonsense. And you can tell it's nonsense exactly because of the Nova Scotia example. Here they went and reduced their emissions at pretty great cost to a lot of people, I will point out. I've got a lot of family out there, and they were paying extra for their power in order to reduce their emissions. But here they're getting no credit for it. They were forced onto the mandatory minimum anyway. And what's interesting here, folks, just a little bit into the fun weeds, is that that's why you saw the sudden turnabout on heating oil, for example, which is primarily used in homes in Atlantic Canada, because all of a sudden, on this past Canada Day, July 1st, Nova Scotians were paying full freight. Bam! They were suddenly paying the entire carbon tax, and they hadn't been doing so up until this past July 1st. And so it was so stark, Franco. I was even getting some text messages from family members saying, what's with this carbon tax thing? Have you heard of this?
Sure have. Yep, sure have.
It's just like, really?
Look, I'm glad you. So what we're gonna do, folks, at the end of this podcast, we're gonna include the video where I break down all the different numbers comparing the carbon tax in Quebec versus the carbon tax everywhere else. So we'll include that at the end of this podcast. But I'm glad you brought up that carve out for furnace oil in Atlantic Canada, because Trudeau saw Liberals, a typical stronghold in Atlantic Canada. He saw us polling out there, plummeting in the polls. So he tried to stop that by instituting a pure political ploy to take the carbon tax off of furnace oil for 3 years, predominantly helping Atlantic Canadian families while leaving 97% of Canadian families out in the cold paying the carbon tax this winter. So that's one proof point, the Atlantic Canadian carve-out, that proves that this carbon tax is all about politics, not the environment. And the second proof point is the special deal for Quebec. It's about politics. It's not about the planet.
Yeah, I was also heartened with, I forget which polling firm it was, but found the majority of Atlantic Canadians nonetheless wanted either frozen or scrapped. So even though they're getting a bit of a reprieve on their home heating oil and good for them, they're still wanting that extended to the rest of Canada if you use natural gas. So that was really nice to see, especially when it comes to heating our home. So speaking of homes, I don't know, I'm sure you've been reading the headlines the same as I've been doing. It's grim. Home prices are just absolutely unaffordable in most of Canada's major cities. I think it was RBC that actually used the term crisis when it came to being able to afford a house. And having come from British Columbia, it is. There's straight up, two-person working people who literally have lost all hope of ever owning a house. And I'm talking professionals. Like they're currently renting a basement suite in Chilliwack type situation, and they'll never be able to afford a house, not even anywhere near Vancouver. And so, yeah, this is a critical issue. Housing has been completely unaffordable. Don't we have a crown corporation whose one job it is to keep housing affordable, Franco, that you love to keep an eye on in Ottawa? What's going on there?
Oh, we sure do. Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. And according to their own website, right, their number one goal, what they're driven by, is housing affordability for all. Well, how are they doing? As you illustrate, not good. Canadians can't buy homes. And I remember there was like a poll done last year that was really telling. It showed that the vast majority of Canadians who don't own a home have given up on the dream of ever becoming homeowners. And also the vast majority of them think that owning a home is now just for the rich in Canada. So it's very sad. It's very stark where like you're kind of sold the dream that if you work hard, you go to school, college, university, trades, whatever, you work hard, you pay your taxes, and one day you'll be able to afford a home. Well, that dream is seemingly lost for so many Canadians. And this Crown Corporation, its one objective, according to its own website, really is housing affordability. Well, it failed. Nonetheless, the CMHC rubber stamped $27 million in bonuses last year. Okay. $27 million in bonuses. 98% of their staff got a bonus. The executives, they have 10 executives at the CMHC. The average bonus for those 10 executives was $83,000. The average bonus for their 10 executives. Okay. Now, I said they gave out $27 million in bonuses last year. Well, the bonuses since the beginning of 2020 is $102 million. Okay. So they've given out more than $100 million in bonuses during this housing affordability crisis when Canadians can't afford to own a home. Okay. This is the prime example of the federal government using taxpayers' money to reward failure with bonuses.
This is brutal. So I read your news release, and then I guess the number didn't really sink in. 27 million? That's higher than, oh my goodness. Okay, so I want to just a couple things here. Number one, it's easy to get lost in the numbers here. But just speaking personally, and I think for most Canadians, owning a home, being able to work hard, earn your money through your own hard work, and being able to own a home to have your family in it is really important. Like, this is not just some financial nest egg for the future. This has profound, like, personal, emotional, and psychological implications here. And if you have an entire generation of working and middle-class people giving up hope on owning a house in Canada, like, that's wrong. Like, that's really, really wrong. And to see that the government is playing a large role in fumbling and dropping this ball completely while giving themselves bonuses is just inexcusable. And I think this ties back into government accountability. So where we're at right now with the mechanisms we have in Ottawa, Franco, where do you see this going as far as being able to hold some of these executives who are failing miserably at CMHC? How do we hold them to account? Like, what's the end game here?
Okay, so I'm glad you asked that. Now, thanks to our Canadian Taxpayers Federation supporters who've been, making sure that we can have one of the best investigative journalists in the country, Ryan Thorpe, because of our CTF supporters, we've been digging up all this bonus information, right? The fact that the CMHC handed out $27 million in bonuses last year, $102 million since the beginning of 2020. The fact that the CBC dished out, $15 million in bonuses in 2023, $114 million in bonuses since 2015. The fact that the Bank of Canada has handed out $55 million in bonuses since the beginning of 2020. The fact that the federal government proper has handed out more than $1 billion in bonuses since 2015, right? That is the investigative journalism work at the CTF. Thank you so much to our supporters, and a great job to Ryan Thorpe, our great investigative journalist. So the reason that Canadians know about this, and they should know about this, is our money, after all, rewarding failure with these taxpayer-funded bonuses, is because of our CTF supporters. Now, this is also becoming like huge news, right? Mm-hmm. Even major the mainstream media outlets are quoting this. You have parliamentary committees bringing some presidents like Catherine Tate of the CBC in front of committees to talk about these taxpayer-funded bonuses. The CBC referenced the CTF's ATIPs on the bonuses on their own newscast, right? So the tide is turning here. And also, too, Conservative Party leader, Mr. Pierre Poilievre, on the Canadian Taxpayers Podcast said that if he were elected prime minister, he would cancel the bonuses for failing government authorities. Okay. And we're going to hold him to accountable on that if he ever is to form government. So the tide is turning, and it's all thanks to our Canadian Taxpayers Federation supporters.
And just can confirm, spent years on the Hill covering committees. I don't ever remember seeing a head of a crown corporation. Most people barely knew their names, okay? Let alone dragged them in front of committee, in front of live cameras with translation, and grilled them about things like spending and bonuses. So to your point, yeah, the tide has definitely turned on this. And to see it actually being covered in mainstream media, including, to your point, literally on the CBC National, Adrienne Arsenault was grilling her boss about bonuses at the CBC, quoting the CTF on this stuff. Like, I thought it was asleep.
I didn't have that on my bingo card. That's for sure.
No, I thought I was like half asleep going, what? Did she just quote CTF? So all this is to say, folks, don't lose hope on being able to hold these guys to account, these guys and gals to account when they're being rewarded with failure. I don't think Franco thinks that this is going to continue forever. And a lot of people have had it. They're fed up and they're pushing back. Now, sorry to end on what I imagine is kind of a gloomy note. We have a federal budget coming up. Now, here in Alberta, not to brag, the budget is balanced. There's a teensy-weensy little surplus, but it's still there, and they're doing pretty good. They're keeping spending in check here, which we're happy to see. What's the deal in Ottawa? Like, are you wearing, like, asbestos level, like, fire retardant flame suits going in there for the dumpster fire? Or what level of emergency is this thing going to be?
Yeah, it's pretty bad. And you know what? Let's, I know we're going to be wrapping up the show pretty quick here. So why don't I just tie this into my taxpayer pro tip? And my taxpayer pro tip is to all of our listeners and to all of our CTF supporters. Now is the time to send the finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, an email or give her office a phone call, okay? Because the budget is on April the 16th. It's time to send her an email. It's time to call the office and say, enough with the madness, cut spending, balance the budget, and absolutely no new taxes or new tax hikes, okay? And here's why I say that, folks. We're looking at a deficit like $40 billion. Now, think about how crazy that is. We're not in a pandemic, okay? $40 billion deficit, okay? This year, the federal government's interest charges will be about $50 billion. Oh. That's about the same amount of money that the federal government sends to the provinces in health transfers. Interest charges, health transfers, okay? In a couple of years, the debt interest charges will be about $60 billion. So in only a handful of years, every time you go purchase something and you pay the federal sales tax, every penny collected from that sales tax will be going to pay interest on the federal debt in only a couple years from now. So things are getting out of hand. Not just that, but we've continually heard Mr. Trudeau muse about a new grocery tax, and a new grocery tax won't make life more affordable. It'll make life more expensive. And if Trudeau wanted to actually make food more affordable, he would scrap his carbon tax. Okay, so here's what we're seeing, or at least what we're hearing. We're seeing the federal government announce billions in new spending, which seemingly seems every day. We have heard the federal government will run about a $40 billion deficit. Interest charges are getting out of hand. You have the prime minister and other members of parliament musing about new taxes. Folks, please, this is my taxpayer pro tip to you, our listeners and our supporters. We're very grateful for you, but now is the time. You have to send Freeland an email. You got to call and you got to say this, okay? I know your budget is April 16th. Balance the budget, cut spending, cut taxes, no new taxes. The time to act is now, folks.
Excellent pro tip. And to Franco's point, remember what we just said earlier in the podcast? Your pushback, your advocacy, you standing up for yourself and your wallet and that of your families, it matters. It may seem like these politicians are ignoring you, but trust me, they're experts at looking calm and cool and fine on the surface. But underneath that surface, they're paddling like a duck. They're like super freaked out about this. So keep up the pressure, folks. Heed Franco's advice. Email and phone the finance minister's office and tell her to get her act together and to balance this budget and to quit hiking taxes and to quit crazy spending. So I actually am going to leave you with a happy note. My taxpayer pro tip is actually a hat tip. And this goes out to the members of the Legislative Assembly here in Alberta and to the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith. And that is, they froze their pay. So they took a pretty decent pay cut back in 2019. I think on average, it was about $7,000 less per MLA per year. So that was very good. And they've frozen their pay. So the premier of the province of Alberta makes around $186,000 per year. That's a very healthy, generous salary. We get that. But did you know that that's less than the mayor of Calgary and the mayor of Edmonton is paid? Franco knew because I actually thought I was misreading the website when I was checking. And I was doing an op-ed about it and I phoned him. I'm like, Franco, does the premier make less than? He's like, then the mayors of both Edmonton. Yes. So the premier of Alberta makes less money than the mayor of Calgary and Edmonton. So and they just took a pay raise. So at City Hall in Calgary and at City Hall in Edmonton, while they're jacking up your property taxes, folks, and crying poor, they gave themselves a pay hike. Okay. In fact, I think this is their third pay hike in a row. In contrast, Alberta, the legislature in Edmonton, is passing on that. They've frozen their pay. So kudos where it's due. We spend a lot of time yelling at politicians. Kudos where it's due. Good on them for keeping their pay frozen. Folks, if you want to join the fight, head on over to our website, taxpayer.com. You can do all sorts of fun things here. See this t-shirt? You can get a t-shirt and you can protest the carbon tax every day of the year. It doesn't have to be a special day. You can get this in t-shirt and in hoodie/bunny hug form. There's all sorts of stuff there. And this is what's most important, guys. I don't know what your favorite petition is, Franco, but you can select from a drop-down menu of petitions that you care about. Like if you want to defund the CBC, if you want to scrap the gun seizure, if you want to remove PST on used thrift shop items, if you want to scrap the carbon tax, there's something there for everybody. And when you do that, you sign up to be part of our taxpayer army. And when Franco tells you, everybody email Freeland now, you will get that call to action. So folks, head on over to our website, taxpayer.com, and help us fight for taxpayers.
And Grant, roll the footage. Trudeau is giving Quebec a special deal on the carbon tax. Quelle surprise. So this is what's going on. Trudeau is making taxpayers in every other province pay a higher carbon tax than in Quebec. So are you ready to see the numbers? Because here at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we had a bit of a math day mixed with an arts and crafts day. Are you ready? So the carbon tax in every other province is $80 per ton. In Quebec, $57 per ton. $80 per ton for you, $57 per ton in Quebec. So now, what does that mean at the pumps? We got you covered here. You pay 17 cents per liter of gasoline. In Quebec, it's 13 cents per liter of gasoline. Well, what about if you're using diesel? We got you covered. You, outside of Quebec, are paying 21 cents per liter of diesel, and in Quebec, 17 cents per liter of diesel. 21 cents for you, 17 cents in Quebec. Well, what about staying warm? Because we all know the carbon tax makes that more expensive too. Got you covered. Okay, outside of Quebec, you're paying 15 cents per cubic meter of natural gas in carbon tax. In Quebec, 10 cents per liter or 10 cents per cubic meter of natural gas. Okay, so outside of Quebec, you're paying 15 cents per cubic meter of natural gas. In Quebec, it's 10 cents per cubic meter. 15, 10. These don't look the same, do they? No, they sure don't. But it's getting worse if you live outside Quebec, because by 2030, that carbon tax gap is increasing. So in 2030, you'll be paying a carbon tax of $170 per ton, courtesy of the Right Honourable Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. In Quebec, it'll be around $97 per ton, okay? So 2030, you pay $170. 2030, Quebec will pay $97 a ton. Now, what does that mean at the pumps? Well, the price of gas, because of the carbon tax increase in 2030, will be 37 cents a liter. In Quebec, it'll be about 23 cents per liter, the carbon tax on gasoline. 37 cents for you, 23 cents in Quebec. A 14 cent per liter difference in carbon tax, courtesy of Trudeau's carbon tax special deal for Quebec. Now, does that sound fair to you? Of course not. And this proves that the carbon tax for Trudeau was always about politics, not saving the environment. Now, fortunately, here at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we're all about solutions. We like to give the solution. And the solution for Trudeau is very simple. Scrap the carbon tax, so everywhere in Canada, there is no carbon tax to lower heating bills, gas bills, and grocery prices. And if you want to learn more about this and other carbon tax issues, head over to taxpayer.com. And when you're there, sign the petition to scrap the carbon tax.